Perceive, process, perform. Do you need inspiration for your practice, or do you simply need to practice inspiration? With this series, we aim to do both. Give us 15 minutes and we'll give you practice inspiration.
My name is David Cohen. I'm an attorney that specializes in helping dentists from a legal transactional business standpoint, and this is your practice inspiration. I want to talk to you today about buying and selling a practice and why it's so important to tell a story when you buy or sell a practice. And the story is told in the purchase agreement. And I'm going to take you through that story and the elements of the story that are really important for you to know, just so you know what questions to ask, who to ask them to, and when to ask them, so that you have that fundamental understanding and just are prepared optimally when you go into your transaction. So, number one, when you enter into the story, the first thing that you talk about in the story is what assets are being sold and what assets are not being sold. It might surprise you that it's just so obvious that you're going to talk about what's being sold and what's not being sold, but you'd be shocked at how many times you see in purchase agreements ambiguity as to what's being sold and what is not being sold. So lesson one, make sure that you identify what's being sold, what's not being sold, so there's no ambiguity or fights at the end of a transaction over whose property is what. Once you've gotten through what's being sold and what's not being sold, you'll move on to the purchase price and how that purchase price is allocated from a tax standpoint. Going into a deal, almost everybody knows what the purchase price is going to be, but they don't always know what the allocation from a tax standpoint will be to that purchase price. I've had clients that look at the allocation and notice that it all adds up to the purchase price, and they're satisfied at that point because it all adds up to the price. What you need to know is that the allocation can have a significant tax impact on either side of the deal. And so it's important to involve your teammates and find out if it's fair or not for you in your transaction. And once you've found out whether it's fair or not, you can negotiate that again with your team, your advisor, your attorney, to help you get through that portion of the story. After you've identified what's being sold and what's not being sold, and the purchase price and the tax allocations, you move on to what promises the parties are making to one another in the deal. These promises are called representations and warranties. The seller is going to make a number of representations and warranties, and the buyer is going to make a number of representations and warranties. The seller is typically going to have more to promise than the buyer is because the seller is actually the one that owns the practice and is selling the practice. Examples might be that the seller warrants that the assets are free and clear of all liens, liabilities, and encumbrances, or that the financial statements they provided to the buyer are true and accurate. Examples for the buyer might be that they have the authority to enter into the transaction to begin with, or that they don't have any conflicts in entering into the deal. Consult your teammates. Make sure there's a thorough amount of representations and warranties and promises that the parties can hold accountable to each other during the transaction process. Once you've identified what's being sold, what's not being sold, the purchase price and the tax allocations, and the promises the parties are making to each other, you move on to what the deal is contingent upon, and these are called contingencies. These contingencies say, if X, Y, or Z don't happen, the deal doesn't happen. It's really important to have contingencies in the deal, mostly because parties like to sign the contract in advance to be effective at a later time. This allows them to get their ducks in a row, so to speak, and be prepared for the transaction and know that they are locked in, subject to the contingencies that I'll give you some examples of. So one example might be that the buyer wants the deal contingent upon them getting the requisite financing to enter into the transaction. Another contingency might be that the buyer has entered into a satisfactory lease for the building because the buyer doesn't want to buy a practice and have nowhere to lease, and the seller certainly doesn't want to sell a practice and continue to have to pay rent. So it's in both parties' best interests most of the time to have a lease contingency in the agreement. These are two examples of contingencies, two things that don't always get resolved upon signature of the purchase agreement that can still be resolved later and be contingencies to the deal. Once you've determined what assets are being sold and what's not being sold, the purchase price and the tax allocations, the promises the parties are making to one another, the contingencies for the deal, you typically move on to some miscellaneous items such as whether accounts receivable are being sold or not, or how the accounts receivable are going to be collected if they're not being sold, how prepaid patients are handled for work that was prepaid by patients that hasn't started yet, works in progress, what happens with patients that are in the middle of their treatment upon the time of the sale. These are just examples of things that are very specific to dentistry that need to be resolved in the contract, and you'll have your dental specific team with you to help you get through those part of the process. And the final item that typically you would get to in the purchase story is the non-compete. And the non-compete is probably the most misunderstood area in these agreements. Many people, such as some lenders, have requirements and thoughts and perceptions that there should be a 3-year, 10-mile non-compete, and that's the standard in every deal. Unfortunately, that's not the case. A 3-year 10 miles might work in some circumstances, and it might not in others. It depends on what state you're in. Your state is going to dictate what the law says surrounding non-competes, and then if non-competes are valid in the state that you're in, you're going to have to cater the parameters of the non-compete to what the law in your state says and allows. So, buyer would not want the seller competing with them, typically for a certain period of time or a certain mileage. Your state's going to govern what the law says, so make sure that you understand the law and you use your teammates to help you understand the law in the state that you're in so you can have an accurate non-compete in your agreement.